Hello, everyone, and thank you for bearing with us on the timing. We are indeed running a little bit late, but we'll make it up to you. So a very, very big thank you for being here. We're super excited to have Mr. Amitav Ghosh here with us. A very big welcome.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Tanya, and with everyone else. It's wonderful to be in Macau again, a place I've really come to love over the years.
That's right, because you've been here a number of times, haven't you?
Yes, I have, for research, etc. But also just to be around. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So just a little bit of context. Our session today is about this book here, which I will tell you more about in a moment. If you know Mr. Ghosh's work, you'll know that he has many, many, many books across many genres. So do not be confused by what you see on display here. The book that we're talking about here today is this one. Tomorrow there is another session with him where he'll be talking about the Opium War. So today we're focusing on climate, tomorrow on opium. So for today's session, we will get started and kicked off with the theme, Narrating the Planetary Crisis, Climate Fiction and the Unthinkable. So what we thought about doing today, given the nature of this topic and how it affects absolutely every single one of us, we thought that we would keep our exchanges a little bit on the shorter side in order to allow you to engage with Mr. Ghosh and to ask your own questions. If that sounds good to you, start thinking about questions as we go along. We'll keep our session to around 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to you. Does that sound good? Okay, fantastic. So let's get started. I do need to introduce you, and that takes a little while because you've done a lot, you've won a lot, and it's worth mentioning. So Amitav Ghosh grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford. His novels, works of non-fiction, and collections of essays have been translated into more than 30 languages and have earned numerous prizes. He has received 8 honorary degrees, 6 Lifetime Achievement Awards, and 4 honorary fellowships. In 2018, he became the first writer working in English to receive India's highest literary honor, the Jnanpith Award. In 2019, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the most important global thinkers of the preceding decade. And he was awarded the Erasmus Prize and elected to the American Academy Awards in Sciences in 2024. And in 2025, he received the Pak Kyung-gi Prize from the South Korea's Toji Foundation. So, with that very, very hefty set of accolades, let's get started with today's topic. So, climate change has been described as a wicked problem. And the book we're exploring today, The Great Derangement, unveils that problem along 3 storylines, or 3 parts rather. The first one is stories. The second one is history, and the third part is about politics. So Amitav, how did this book come about for you? Because you wrote this in 2016, so we're going on 10 years. What prompted this writing and this non-fiction narrative?
Well, actually, I wrote the book in 2015. It was published in 2016. What happened is that, in the year 2000, I wrote a book, which you can see over there, called The Hungry Tide. I started researching that book. The Hungry Tide is set in the Sundarban, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, and it's the southern fringe of the Bengal Delta, of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, and it has the largest proportion of tigers of any place in the world. No, actually, the largest number of tigers are actually in captivity in the United States. But, of wild tigers...
Tiger King comes to mind.
Yes. Of wild tigers, this is the place where, there's the greatest number. Anyway, while writing this book, I really became aware of, the many dimensions of our planetary crisis, species extinctions, biodiversity loss, climate change. Already back then in the year 2000, when I began doing my research, you could already see the effects of sea level rise on this area, but most of all on biodiversity loss. I've known this region since my childhood. And once upon a time, the sky was filled with birds. Now you hardly ever, there are very few really, considering the sort of place that it is. So, at that point, I really wasn't that much engaged with these issues. But in the following years, a series of storms really affected me, even personally. I was in New Orleans a few weeks before Hurricane Katrina. Then I was and actually I watched Hurricane Katrina from Mauritius. I happened to be in Mauritius at the time researching a book, the book that also brought me here. But it was very interesting to watch, Hurricane Katrina unfolding in Mauritius, because Mauritius also is often hit by cyclones. But over the years, they've developed these elaborate protocols so that nobody ever dies, And there we were looking at, the world's most advanced, so to speak, nation, just absolutely devastated by this storm. So that was, there was that. Then there was Cyclone Aila, which devastated the Sundarban. Then there was Hurricane Sandy, which hit, the city where I live, which is New York. So over the years, really, Bengal, where I'm from, is a cyclone-prone region, just as the Pearl River Delta is, And somehow it seemed, these repeated storms seemed to be almost speaking to me, And finally, I just felt this incredible sense of urgency. I felt I had to write about it. But what I felt I had to write about... So I'll tell you a strange episode with which this book begins. Way back, in 1976, I was a student in Delhi University. I was, I think, what was it, about 20 at that time? And I happened to be studying the weather was very strange that day. And I happened to be in the university library, and the weather was so weird. I mean, there was a hailstorm, and there were, strong winds and so on. But I felt sort of kind of disturbed, and I left the library, and I started walking to see a friend. And it was just, not far from the library. And as I was walking there, I looked over my shoulder, and I suddenly saw this protrusion from the sky coming towards me. It was like a finger, literally. It was coming towards me. And, I had the good sense. I suppose if it were today, I'd probably have taken a selfie and be dead. But I had the good sense to run, I ran and I leapt into a sort of, into a kind of balcony. And then suddenly this thing was on me. It was on, it just went roaring down the street. I could see shacks and stalls and bicycles and motorcycles, even cars just whirling through the air, And, it lasted like about a second, couple of seconds. And then I got up and there was absolute devastation all around me, And I later discovered that it was a tornado, but this was the only known tornado ever to have struck New Delhi, certainly in recorded meteorological history. And it just went down, touched down for like 1 kilometer, but something like 100 people were killed, lots of buildings were destroyed. During this thing, as it was passing over, I looked up. Really, I was almost in the eye, and I could see, the way this storm passed over me. And I'm a writer, so I draw on my experiences. When I write novels, and I had tried for years and years to incorporate this experience in a novel, and I'd never succeeded. Why? Because every time I tried to write it, it just seemed so improbable. What are the chances, that you'd be in this particular place at this particular moment where something had never happened before, but then it happens. So that set me off thinking, what is it about experiences like these that make them so difficult to represent? And I ultimately came, my answer ultimately was that, we live, since the 19th century, since the sort of early years of modernity, we've been really living in an age that is determined by probability. Everything in life now, even more so today, because all the data that we rely on now comes out of probabilistic, equations and so on. So, and probability is very much at the heart of the modern novel, because if you ever put in something very improbable, the critics will immediately seize upon it and say, "Oh, this is so improbable! I can't believe this." So, I'm sure you've all heard of the literary critic Franco Moretti, who says really he's very perceptive about the modern novel, and what he says the modern novel really is that you just insert a lot of fillers, to make the story sound grounded in reality. I'm of course talking about modern realistic novels, and I think he's certainly onto that. So in a sense, the logic of probability really determines the functioning of the realist novel, if you like. But that's the thing. Once we've entered the planetary crisis, everything is improbable. Nothing is probable any longer in our world. We've sort of exited the world that was probable once upon a time. And I think that is a profound challenge, to our modes of representation and our modes of thinking. So that's what, this book is about, in a sense.
Well, it's interesting. So you're mentioning the natural world, tigers, and then this personal experience with this finger that came from above and pointed at you in a very unlikely climatic experience. And I hear what you're saying about the wildlife. We think that these things sometimes take centuries or very long times to manifest. However, I spend a lot of time in Africa, and when I go on safari, on my watch, I can tell you now that when I'm looking for a herd of elephants, it always comes with a disclaimer. Oh, there used to be 150 families, now we've got 2. And it's happening on our watches, and it's very disconcerting, because we like to think that this is something that we can kick down the road or that we can deal with in time when we've got the resources, but it's happening in front of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for this novel, The Hungry Tide, actually one of the main themes is about a certain kind of river dolphin. It's the Irrawaddy dolphin is its common name, known to science as Orcaella bravirostris, because it's distantly related to the killer whale, the orca, or Sinus orca. So I traveled up the Mekong with this young biologist who was doing a census of the Irrawaddy dolphin population in the Mekong. And, it was really heartbreaking, because actually this population is completely disappearing now from the Mekong and will soon actually disappear. And it also made me realize, how difficult it is for these young scientists who are working, on these issues, just to see these animals disappearing in front of their eyes.
Okay, so let's move further into climate change. It is described as the unthinkable, as you mentioned, an event that our institutions, narrative forms, and imaginations are ill-equipped to process. In the 10 years since the book was published, how unthinkable are the areas of stories, history, and politics today? How does that manifest in the unthinkable?
Let me say to begin with that I think if I were writing that book again today, I wouldn't make it so much focused on climate change, because actually, as Margaret Atwood famously said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. Because every dimension of our lives are now changing, and there are so many unfolding crises. Whether it be biodiversity loss, species extinctions, and of course climate change is a part of it. But along with all of that, is we can see a geopolitical crisis, which is very deeply and closely linked to all these other forms of crisis. So that's the first thing I would say, that we have to sort of broaden our minds out of a reductionist focus, on whether it's on climate change or anything else. Sorry, what was the rest of your question?
It was about the three areas, so stories, politics, and history, and how the...
the unthinkable, yes.
Yeah, how the unthinkable...
See, the reason I use the word unthinkable is that unlike many people who think about these issues, certainly my scientist friends and others who concern themselves with this question, they generally tend to think about this as in relation to the future. And that's partly an effect of the statistical methods that they often use, which are always posited in relation to a time horizon, 2100 or 2050 or whatever. But I don't think of it like that at all. I think of our planetary crisis as something arising out of history and something very deeply rooted in the past. So the argument that I essentially make in the Nutmeg's Curse, which is in many ways builds upon the arguments of the Great Derangement, is that I think what we are actually seeing is not a techno-scientific problem, as a lot of people think, especially technologically minded people think. I think what it is that it's an extension of the wars of extermination that were fought, beginning with the 17th century onwards. And in fact, the reason the book is called The Nutmeg's Curse is that it begins with this episode that happened in the Banda Islands, in the extreme eastern end of Indonesia, in 1621. So, the Banda Islands, which I don't know, have you all heard of it? Heard of the Banda Islands? So the nutmeg tree was endemic to the region around the Banda Islands, and the nutmeg tree produces both the nutmeg and mace. These were two of the most valuable spices, in the world in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, and so on. So the reason that the Portuguese came here to Macau is to find their way to the Banda Islands, or to the Moluccas. This was just an afterthought, really,
Don't tell them that.
So, they had their eyes absolutely set, on cloves, which were endemic to Ternate, Tidore, and that little archipelago, and on the nutmegs. So the Dutch entered the race a bit late. They first came to the Bandas 1600, and it's said that the great volcano of the Bandas, which is known as Gunung Gapi, erupted as soon as it saw the Dutch approaching to it. But this is a strange thing about Gunung Gapi. It's frequently erupted at moments of crisis, moments of political crisis, Anyway, so the Dutch went there, and, as the Dutch tended to do, they tried to impose, a monopolistic treaty on the Bandanese. And the Bandanese naturally resisted because they had long-standing, they were not a primitive people. They were rich. They traded across the Indian Ocean. They had partners in the Arab world, in Africa, in Asia. So they couldn't just give all that up and say, oh, you foreigners have come here and suddenly you want to take all our nutmeg. So they resisted. And in the end, the then viceroy, who was a man called Jan Koen, he said, we have to have a final solution to this problem, So in 1621, he put together a fleet, And they went to the Banda Islands. The Bandanese were not, they weren't many in number. There were only like 15,000 of them. So he went to these islands, and over a period of like 8 weeks, they literally exterminated the Bandanese. 1/3 were actually killed. 1/3 fled into the highlands where they starved, and the rest were enslaved and taken to Java. It's one of the most horrifying episodes that one can think of, really. But just think of it, for the Bandanese, the nutmeg tree was literally their tree of life. And in every civilization, really, there is this concept of the tree of life. But for the Bandanese, this amazing being, really, the tree, became, in fact, the tree of death. So they were the first to suffer the resource curse, what is now devastating the Persian Gulf. So it's the same story, it's the same story of extractivism, which enters the world with a certain kind of European colonialism that has now globalized this effect. And the reason why I say that I think the fundamental dynamic of climate change is really very similar to a war of extermination. Once upon a time, it was the quiet part. It was not said out loud. But now these multi-billionaires and so on, especially those in Silicon Valley, have quite explicitly said that they expect and indeed want, a mega death event. That's why they're building these huge retreats on islands where they'll run off and hide until billions of people die, and then they'll come up and rebuild another government.
I wonder what they think's going to happen when all those hungry people find the bunkers and just kind of hang around and wait. Like, how does that story go? I guess
it's completely delusional. I mean, if you think about it, but the problem with it is that the people who are doing this are the most powerful people in the world. Mark Zuckerberg has a doomsday shelter, which is an island, and he tried to keep it secret, but it leaked.
It's in Hawaii.
Yeah, Peter Thiel has one. They all have these, and that's the disaster, really. That essentially they are anticipating this mega death event. And of course, what they also anticipate is that the people who will die will be the black and brown people of the world. And I think this is the fundamental dynamic, the reason why Western elites, and especially American elites, don't really want to do anything about the climate business at all, because they think, it's not they who will die, that it's going to be the black and brown people who will.
You talk about that in the book, and also just to go back to what you just said about patterns, right? If we're talking about hundreds of years ago for maize or cloves, or we're talking about oil or coal right now, you mentioned an interesting point about coal and oil in this book, which is the difference about how you get to these resources, with coal being a lot more labor intensive, needing a lot more people, resources, processes, and stages, and with that comes inevitable bottlenecks and questions and more friction. Whereas with oil, it seems a little bit more seamless, a little bit more under the radar, a little bit more elegant, as it were, for a solution, and that the very wealthy hedge their bets on oil and are a little bit less traceable around that, and that the wealthiest countries in the world are the oil-producing countries. I had never made that distinction between coal and oil in that way, and again, it's extractivist resources and the quest for that.
See, it's not just with coal and oil. Basically, what capitalism and what capitalists want is to be able to profit from their energy source and to be able to control that energy source. So in the late 18th century, in fact, wind especially wind and water power were used much more extensively than coal, and in fact they were just as efficient. So if you go, for example, to Lancashire, or if you go to New England, you'll see that the huge textile mills were basically driven by water wheels, and they work perfectly well. But the reason why the big capitalists changed to coal power is not because of efficiency. They changed because through coal, they could control the worker better, And that's been the story from then on. So coal afforded more control for the capitalist. It allowed also profits to flow upwards more. Then from about 1910 onwards, when Winston Churchill, who is really the evil genius of this story, if you like, he was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he realized that actually oil is another step up in control. Because unlike coal, which has to be mined by miners, and miners have historically been at the forefront of every progressive movement, which is why Margaret Thatcher also wanted to destroy them and succeeded, really. But oil doesn't need a huge workforce, and it doesn't even need to be shipped. Although, of course, a lot of it does have to be, but oil can be handled by very small groups of actually very highly paid people. So this became the reason why Churchill he also, in consultation with the Americans, decided that he would switch the entire British fleet over from coal to oil. And then, later, after the war, the Marshall Plan appeared very, very, how shall we say, unselfish, like an altruistic thing for the United States, but it was linked to the use of oil. The Marshall Plan actually promoted the use of oil throughout Europe. So, we see behind this a consistent pattern of elites, imposing these uses upon people. Now, just think about it, if you had wind and solar, you don't have to depend on the big companies. You can go and sit in a farm and just, be completely independent. And actually, because of these weird circumstances, Cuba is actually now pioneering this. Cuba first, they pioneered, because they were denied oil supplies, they pioneered various ways of surviving without, especially agriculture. So Cuba is really, in a sense, way ahead of the rest of us. Now what they're doing is that they're installing solar capacity at an unbelievable rate. Because they've been absolutely cut off from, there's a huge blockade on them and so on. So just think, what's not to like about solar and... but if you go to America, there's actually, the elites have started this war against alternative energy.
It's true what you say about entering a new era, and that new era is palpable and visible in so many ways. The age of the Anthropocene, which is where some say that we already are, is very much about our effects on the planet and the impacts that we are having on icebergs and carbon capture and all those elements. But of the two schools of thought between technology will save us or we need to return to the ways of the world and respect the cycles and work within those means or those boundaries, it feels like we're all being led down the technology will save us school of thought with a certain group of people in charge. And like you said, there's no more, it's almost like the veil has come off. We're not even pretending anymore. There's so much transparency around different conversations, and it's almost disconcerting just in the way that it's so blatant, right? We're not even kind of pretending anymore. So we're entering kind of uncharted territory in so many ways. And if we think about the technology that we use in our own well-being, such as metrics to monitor our oxygen levels, our glucose levels, we monitor everything nowadays. And we've really tapped into this idea of statistics, probability, numbers, and how we're going to save ourselves. But we've kind of forgotten to look around us, to try and look for those tiger's eyes, to kind of read the tea leaves, as it were. Why are they not here with us anymore? So almost, in some ways, almost a little bit too smart for our own good is somehow the irony of it all.
Or let's just say they think they're very smart. I don't think they are actually very smart, but that's what they think. And it's one of the tragedies of of the contemporary moment is that everything, every metric is tied to data, to numbers. And I think, in fact, numbers are serving the purpose of blinding us, to the world around us.
Yeah, it helps for the algorithms and the numbers on that line. Okay, so towards the end of the book, you talk about two very prominent documents that came out in 2015, one being the Paris Agreement, and then the other one by Pope Francis, the Laudato Si. Pronounce that correctly? Okay. Two documents relating to the environment, but from very different approaches. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Paris Agreement, where a number of different countries came together and set out the map for what carbon emissions are going to look like and who's going to do what and where. And apparently it was a very, very long document with very few full stops and a lot of commas and ambiguous language and technocratic language, whereas the other document by Pope Francis was a lot more heartfelt and almost like a call to cultural transformation and spiritual transformation, drawing on wisdom and practices that largely predate the carbon economy. That took you somewhat by surprise. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, I was taken by surprise. Actually, I don't know if you've ever read the Paris Declaration. I mean, it's just gobbledygook. Climate change is hardly even, those words are hardly ever used, Fossil fuels are never mentioned. I compared the two documents rhetorically, the rhetoric of the two documents, because I found it very interesting. The Paris Declaration, written by technocrats, is written in a certain kind of technocratic language. And you can see from this language that essentially what they're doing is that they're trying to keep the wider world away. They want to establish their these experts want to establish their dominion over this problem, and nobody else can have a voice in it, And I think that's really one of the most important elements of this disaster that we are in, that climate, so to speak, has passed into the stewardship of this expert class, which of all is the most blinded by numbers, Whereas when you look at Pope Francis's Laudato Si, I still think it's the best thing that's been written on these issues, It's incredibly well informed about the science because he worked with major scientists, but it's written in such simple language, He makes very complex issues, available, as it were, to the world. One is a document that's trying to close in on itself, and the Pope's is a document that's opening itself out. And I think the reason for that is that Pope Francis worked among the poor. He knew what it meant to speak to the poor. It's a very beautiful document, as you say, exactly for this for these reasons, that he really nails it. He says the things that the expert class is not allowed to say, which is that fundamentally we can't live like this. We can't go on consuming like this. We have to find satisfaction in other things. We have to find other ways of thinking about the world, that we've got it all wrong. We have to think about it in a different way. So, I think really until the end of his life, he remained, for me, I must say, a fount of real wisdom, on these issues.
And before we open up to the floor, I've got one more question, and that is around how do you personally stay engaged, open, hopeful throughout this whole kind of marathon that is living in contemporary society, knowing what we know, feeling the way we feel? How do you look after your mind and your heart?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because, I think it's what Antonio Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Because really, if you look at all the data or you look at all the trends, they're all going in the worst possible direction. And, we'll probably kill each other off with nuclear weapons before before the climate or the environment does it. But either way, we're heading in a disastrous direction. We can all see it, I mean, just think, the affluent nations, most of all the affluent nations in Europe, they promised to contribute, what was it, 100 billion to a climate mitigation fund? Not even 10 billion of that turned up. Why? They said, we can't afford it. We don't have the money. We don't have the budgets. As soon as the war in Ukraine started, they suddenly found 1 trillion to invest in armaments,
Thank you for that. We're going to open the floor to you. Jump in. Give us your best shot.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your fantastic talk. Could I ask after this if you could equate the problem with climate change to also, and everything that's unfolding around us, as you say, it's not only about climate change, but about a lack of humanity that the world is going through, that people are losing conscience or feelings or some humanity for other people, maybe farther from them, I would say.
Yeah, I think what's happened in these last few years is that, as you said, all pretense of decency has been given up. Jan Koen was actually briefly reprimanded by the Dutch East India Company. Now we see genocides occurring where nobody even cares. I mean, people brag about it.
Thank you. Who else would like to share?
Thank you. Thank you for your explanation and your talk. I have a question. So we are all here not from the Gen Z. We are a bit older here, right? So we all learn, we read, we have maybe different education. So I would like to know, what do you think about the Gen Z? Are they concerned, and not those who went to university? I talk about the less educated masses, maybe, if I may say so, or around the world, because the young generation, they are the one to fix all this. I don't think we're going to fix anything. So what is your thoughts about the future, about my kids, 20, 25-year-old? They are concerned. They went to study. They are really, I think many of our kids probably like this, but there are so many million children out there who have no clue about climate change, I think, or even about wars or nuclear weapons or what Trump is doing. They have no interest, but they will be they will be affected, of course. So I'd just like to see your thoughts on that.
In my experience, actually, Gen Z is actually very motivated. The young kids today, I would say 20-somethings are down to teenagers. They know in their hearts that the world that is opening out in front of them is a completely disrupted world, that they will never have the lives of their parents. I mean, my generation, we had it good. We lived off the fat of the land. And they will have to pay that price. They know this. They understand it viscerally, and I can tell you this because I'm often invited to speak to young people, here and there. And they seem to really respond to what I'm saying. They almost seem to have known what I'm saying without me having to say it. And I see this all over. It's true that there are places where, younger people seem kind of indifferent. But there are also, in Bangladesh, for example, awareness of climate change is very widespread, even amongst the poor, This is the problem with these oligarchs, They think that all these poor black and brown people will conveniently die off one day, but it's not going to happen like that. Your ordinary Bangladeshi farmer has a plan for dealing with climate change. And his plan actually makes a lot more sense than the plans that experts draw up for them.
Like not building your house along the shore to get the prime views, but
Yes.
right? So there's a certain inherent resilience that comes with certain life experiences. But I would like to weigh in, if I may, because this is one of my favorite topics, and I'm going to go a little off-piste here, so bear with me. But as somebody who's child-free, I frequently go to sustainability events, and I would say 9 out of 10 times, whatever the topic, whatever the area, whatever the audience, it always frequently ends with, but the next generation, the future, the children. I'm like, that feels like a cop-out, because this is happening on all our watches. They are born into it. They didn't really have a choice. If they know a lot about carbon capture, it's because they have to, not because that's their choice of time spending. So it feels almost like we're just handing it over to them and saying, you'll figure it out, you've got the way to do it. And we're all here right now, and we're living longer than we ever have, and we might be around for a lot longer. And how do we, irrespective of our age, how do we join something that's more optimistic and positive and forward thinking, rather than just saying, hey, those who came behind us will figure it out? That's just a personal experience.
No, I agree. I think we can't just say let them fix it and unload the whole problem on them.
More questions?
I don't need the microphone, I think. So I very much liked. I read the NetMex course. I very much liked the way you put out things and relations in between.
Thank you.
All the aspects, history and the present. It's the only book I have read of yours. But could you talk a little bit about the other books where the opium is particularly mentioned as a topic, and which one is it? Because I think we will like to know a little bit more about those books. Trilogy, right?
Yeah. Well, the trilogy, it's the Ibis trilogy. It's called, the first one is Sea of Poppies, then River of Smoke, and then Flood of Fire. 3 books. The strange thing about the whole opium story is that it's very much, again, a story of extractivism. I mean, the setup under which the British produced opium in India was absolutely extractivist. They forced essentially these farmers to cultivate opium, creating famines. Even the cultivation of opium so disrupted the agricultural cycle that a whole series of famines occurred under British colonialism. But even during famines, they made these farmers produce opium, It's just the most horrifying story. And the farmers were forced to sell this opium to the British Opium Department, and they sold it below cost. Then the British would package it and smuggle it into China, where they, sold it for enormous profits. Now, if you look at the discourses that surround the whole issue of how they justified this, how they thought about it, they would argue free trade. Now, many of these merchants were actually Scottish, so they had studied in Edinburgh, a generation after Adam Smith, if you like, but they used his theories to apply, to justify what they were doing. But what Adam Smith got really so profoundly wrong is that supply and demand don't always equilibrate. Especially when you're dealing with addictive substances, supply creates the demand. The best possible example of that is what happened with Purdue Pharma in the 1990s, when they flooded the market with these opioids. Before they started flooding the market with opioids, there was no opioid crisis in America. Then within 2 years, there was this incredible opioid crisis which has profoundly disrupted America, I personally think that what America is living through today is, as it were, a reversal of China's opium crisis of the 19th century. You see exactly the same patterns. You see, these in 19th century China, it sparked off one of the most destructive civil wars in history. Already you can see a simmering low-level civil war across the collective West, if you like. You see it sparked off these wars. You see now a war in Venezuela, on the pretext of stopping the flow of drugs. It's really uncanny, the resemblances between the two crises. In 19th century China, there were many writers actually who predicted all this and who saw all of it happening.
How does it end?
It ends very, very badly.
Maybe we can get a few rewrites done in this time. More questions, please. We've got a bit of time left, so make the most of it. Let's. You can ask about other books as well. There's a whole collection of different types of writing as well. Please feel free to jump in.
There we are.
No, we're not.
My job is
done. How much time do we have left? 5-10 minutes? Okay. Is there something that you feel? I've heard you use the word uncanny a lot, and I wanted to ask you about that. When you think of the word uncanny, do you associate it with supernatural by chance, or is it just uncanny of that kind of coincidental?
Well, my experience with the tornado in Delhi, that was profoundly uncanny, And since then, I've had many such experiences. I think we all have these experiences which are really not reducible to easy things, I think one of the great sources of the problem that we live in, one of the things that Pope Francis was pointing to, is this whole idea that science can explain everything, that a technological mindset is exhaustive of all reality, and that what you can see and touch and feel is all that exists. That was really the sort of thinking that he was challenging. My latest book, which isn't here, although it was in Hong Kong, so you can buy it there. My latest book is called Ghost Eye, and it's a novel. And, it's a novel that begins with a child, a 3-year-old child, talking about her memories of her past life. Now, there are many weird things in this world, but one of the strangest things is actually that so many children are born with memories of past lives, there are so many recorded cases, verified cases, that it's a phenomenon that we cannot deny. It exists, it happens in the world. Some cultures recognize it as an actual phenomenon, some don't, but it happens as much in cultures that don't recognize it. So some of the most famous cases actually come from North America, amongst white people. So what do we do with this phenomenon? We don't usually talk about it, simply because it's so profoundly disturbing, But if that phenomenon does occur, already we have something which is completely inexplicable by the standards that modernity imposes upon us, And as soon as we recognize this phenomenon as something that exists, we see that the whole superstructure of a certain kind of contemporary ideology completely dissolves. And I think it's very important to do this, to restore, in some sense, the intuition that the world is a very strange and miraculous and marvelous place. In fact, it's much stranger than anything that this technoscientific mindset can provide us. I feel kind of embarrassed saying this because I was very much educated to be a part of a kind of expert class, if you like. And that's why I realized that almost so much of what I was taught was just wrong. It was just nonsense. Whether it be the Opium Wars or, so much else, actually.
Just to touch on that crisis of the imagination that you talk about frequently, I was working with some climate fiction authors, cli-fi is what it's called, and they were talking about one of our biggest challenges is that if we can't imagine something, we're never going to get anywhere near actually creating it. And no matter how absurd or bombastic it might sound, until you can visualize or create some emotional or mental or physical connection to it in whichever way resonates with you, until we can get to that point, we're never going to get any closer. It might take us a really long time. It might not take us a long time at all. It feels like the world's speeding up nowadays, but it's a crisis, it's a failure of imagination. And we shoot ourselves down, we talk ourselves off out of ideas, we create these smaller worlds for ourselves because we're embarrassed to say something that might sound outrageous or to stand out or to question things. But it's really to our own disadvantage to not be open to these things and to support it.
See, I must say that I think if you're writing within the confines of a genre such as climate fiction or cli-fi, you're never going to be able to imagine anything genuinely different. Because what does the word climate really mean? It means a certain kind of data-driven discourse, And if you subject your imagination completely to that data-driven discourse, how are you going to imagine other ways of thinking? Is that all that literature has to contribute? What you're actually doing, if you subscribe to that, is that you're subordinating yourself, to another discourse, which has nothing to do with your basic work.
You've mentioned that it sometimes ends up in the realms of vampires and unicorns and those areas. So yes, thank you. We've got 5 minutes left. I believe you have a question. Let me give you a...
Thank you very much. I'm glad you just mentioned the idea of imagination and the role of literature, because do you think that literature and fiction, for example, is a powerful tool to subvert ideology? Because I remember you mentioning somewhere that literary critics are creating just another space. It might not directly reflect reality, it's just a facet of reality. Do you think literature then serves the role to reflect some parts of reality as well? Things like you were mentioning, things that could not be explained, or some uncanny things that could not be explained by science. Do you think literature could, in fact, provide a space for that to manifest? Thank you.
It could, and it does, But the writers who are doing the most interesting work are probably not the writers you necessarily have heard of, Ruth Hoseki is an amazing and wonderful writer who does amazing work along those lines. I would say, well, Barbara Kingsolver is incredibly famous, so you probably, you certainly will have heard of her work. Richard Powers is another writer along those lines. The problem is not so much the writers. Writers have always thought about these issues and so on. And, many writers that I have not heard of, you have not heard of. And the reason we have not heard about them is not because writers are not doing the hard work of imagining these things. It's because literature, so-called, as a sort of institution, is incredibly conservative. It's the gatekeepers who really prevent us from, embracing that kind of writing. Because just think about it, who runs the publishing houses? Who does the reviewing? Who runs the review journals? They're all like, people who've been to elite institutions, often mainly men, and, they decide what you can read and what you can't read. Fortunately, I think it's changing now, but let's hope it changes faster.
Time's up. Thank you so much, everyone. That was wonderful. Really appreciate your time.